The impact of Hurricane Ike in terms of what it may do to oil platforms could be just the latest chapter in what has already been a frightening week for the U.S. economy. On Monday, the two biggest financial institutions in the country, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, were taken over by the government at a cost of untold billions. The combination of inflation and unemployment, also known as the misery index, is at the worst level in 20 years. Lehman Bros, a giant investment bank, and Washington Mutual, a huge commercial bank, are now in danger of bankruptcy. And now the big three automakers are begging the government for help, saying they cannot survive on their own. Joining us to talk about this is Naomi Klein, author of The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. She also writes an internationally syndicated column for The Nation and The Guardian. Naomi, whose fault are so many of these financial problems?
Well, if we look at what's going on right now with Lehman Brothers, this is the subprime mortgage crisis continuing. Even though the Republicans couldn't say the word foreclosure at their recent convention, it's still going on. This was the largest underwriter of subprime mortgages. And they were recently saying that all was well, handed out $5.7 billion in bonuses to their staff just last year in the middle of the crisis, and now they're tanking. But this is directly related to the Bush policies. You know, there's a phrase we haven't heard in a long time, but we used to hear a lot, which was the ownership society. That was Bush's favorite idea coming into power. In fact, Grover Norquist predicted that this would be his greatest legacy long after people forgot the name Fallujah. Now, they never talk about the ownership society, but what that was a deliberate Bush administration policy of encouraging high-risk loans
without government regulation. In other words, the argument being that there was nothing to put the brakes on some of the risks that some of these institutions were taking.
It was really a policy of creating a bubble in the housing market. And it really, if we look at the timing, they started pushing the ownership society in 2001, 2002. So it really replaced the dot-com bubble when that burst. And this was a new way to get rich too quick. And the deregulation was built into it. It was specifically a directive to the market and to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to make these high-risk loans because the Bush administration wanted more people to own homes regardless of the consequences, and that's the bubble that's bursting.
Now we're going away from, of course, absolutely no regulation to possibly a lot of regulation when the government comes in and steps out and helps Lehman Brothers try to refinance and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Is that the right move? John McCain, for example, is supporting now the takeover of Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and we'll see what he does with Lehman Brothers.
We'll see what happens with Lehman Brothers, but regardless, we've seen this happen now with Bear Stearns. We've seen it with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And, you know, the issue is what comes next. The government did not have a choice. If they didn't step in with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, you'd be looking at depression levels of evictions. It couldn't happen. But the question is what happens after they take over. And what McCain-Palin are pushing for, what the Heritage Foundation is pushing for, what many Republicans are pushing for, is first to use taxpayer money to bail out the investors, and then essentially to feed the remains back to Wall Street, to break them up and privatize them. So the taxpayers take on all the risk, all the burden. The investors win when times are good. After the public has stepped in to bail them out, then they get another shot at it, feeding off the remains.
And yet, what it does is it also adds massively to the U.S. debt, the deficit, because in addition to, for example, paying for the war off budget, there's no plan yet to figure out where is the money going to come from to essentially bail out the automakers, if that's what it takes, or Lehman Brothers. It's simply coming from the special fund known as borrowing from the future.
Exactly. But I think with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, it's worth remembering that they exist for a reason. That they came out of the Great Depression. Fannie Mae was born in 1938 precisely because there was so much homelessness, because there were so many evictions, there was such a need for housing. So there is a need for these institutions. The question is, you know, if taxpayers are going to pay for it, then they should at least be serving the public interest.
Naomi Klein, very interesting. Thanks for coming in, and certainly a very frightening scenario when you look at all the problems in our financial industry right now. A lot of problems that sometimes don't get talked about because of hurricanes and politics. But in any case, Naomi, thank you very much. President